thank you all for being here today. We're delighted to have Zach Harned here today from Fenwick West to celebrate the launch of our new legal office hours program. This is a complimentary 30-minute legal consultation with a corporate or intellectual property attorney on topics like IP concerns involving patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets, data privacy and security, commercial and licensing agreements, company formation and financing, general startup operations, and any other questions you may have. You can make a request via a form on the AIMI Center website, and that's available to anyone from the Stanford community, faculty, staff, and students. As I said, Zach is an attorney at Fenwick West, which has a storied history, and I did a little research today about their history in Silicon Valley, and just want to acknowledge their generous support for this office hours program. But I found some interesting things. So Fenwick West did the original incorporation of Apple Computer in 1976. They also negotiated one of the first licensing agreements with a 19-year-old Bill Gates. They took Oracle and eBay public. They negotiated the first copyright of a graphical user interface and defended Amazon's one-click patent. So, and many, many more. You can go to their website and learn more about their history, but I thought those were all very interesting. So Zach himself works at Fenwick and advises on a variety of intellectual property matters with a focus on technology transactions and commercial matters for clients in the technology, AI, machine learning, digital health, and life sciences industries. He's also counseling clients on technology, IP, commercial contracts, and open source aspects of venture financings and mergers and acquisitions. We're delighted to have him here today. His title of his talk is The FDA, AI and Machine Learning, and Medical Devices. Zach, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you for such a wonderful and warm introduction. I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen. So great. I was going to move on to then talk about the AI legal office hours, but Kurt did such a wonderful job overviewing that. So hopefully me and my colleagues will be seeing some of you in the future. Very excited for this program. And again, so grateful to AIMI for their partnership on this. So many, many thanks there. A quick disclaimer to get out of the way. So in terms of today's talk, I'll be providing not legal advice, which is the kind of thing that creates client relationships and sort of other complications, but instead legal education. And in this case, everything we're going over is all sort of public information related to the FDA. So it's in a very sort of safe arena, which is great. So first of all, why care about the FDA? As you might know, they're sort of a giant agency. They regulate, all kinds of different things, a huge number of medical devices that we'll be focused on today. There's sort of various questions you might go through in the preliminary side of things to figure out, am I even subject to FDA's regulatory authority in the first place? This is sort of a much larger topic, and there's lots of other sort of guidances on there. But if you find out you are subject to the authority, you care because much like the Hulk, you don't want to see the FDA when they're angry, right? And there's lots of notorious cases like this in which individuals have found themselves suffering the wrath of the FDA, and that's no good. So we want to keep you out of that kind of trouble for sure. So the FDA regulates, like most agencies, in terms of either giving rules and regulations, which are binding, they have the force of law, just as if Congress had passed it, or via guidance, which is non-binding. And FDA's major tool that they use is this sort of non-binding guidance, in part because it's much easier to sort of put these out on a more rapid, pace. And again, technology is developing quickly, so FDA is trying to keep up with that. So although it's, not strictly enforceable, it's still a really good idea to follow because the FDA is trying to give you a heads up for here's how we're thinking about these particular issues. Here's a sort of big map of the FDA. Today, we're going to be focused on CDRH. So we're talking about AI and machine learning, and that affects all kinds of different areas. So the folks over at Cedar and CBER who are working on drugs and biologics are also very interested in AI and machine learning, but we're sort of glossing over all of that, and we're focusing just on the medical device side of the house for today. And a lot of that is taking place via this Digital Health Center of Excellence, which used to be a division that's now sort of been promoted to a center of excellence. And they're really working to sort of update, the regulatory framework for digital health, of which AI and machine learning is a big piece of. Okay, so as a quick preliminary matter, we just want to note that FDA has been in the software game for a long time, right? You can see here as early as 2002. They just put out another sort of recent guidance in 2021 that's replacing the old 2005 guidance. So they've been working in order to try and help regulate software for a very long time now. The sort of interesting change is the introduction of AI machine learning software and some of the intricacies that introduces. So what we're going to be walking through today is 8 different time points. So these 6 plus 2 more that have come out since then, just to try and understand how the FDA is, sort of viewing in terms of its publicly put out information, AI and machine learning, how they're attempting to approach those sort of considerations, and how we, should be viewing it as potential developers, innovators, things like that. So the first time point is their discussion paper. And we're going to spend probably a lot of time on this because it was one of the meatier guidances that they put out. This was a sort of white paper, essentially, they're putting out, trying to solicit some feedback and input from. And the basic rub is that they recognize, usually for software, it can be like a drug, right? You sort of, put it out once, and then there's not necessarily sort of a need to change it. And if there's a significant need to change it, you have to go through another procedure with the FDA. In this case, let's say your software got approved through the 510K pathway, a very sort of common one for, a middle of the road risky device. If you significantly change it, then you need to go through this sort of process again, which can be quite lengthy as well as expensive. So in the world of AI machine learning, right, these algorithms, are themselves changing frequently, right, depending on if they're continuously adaptive or things like that. And so it's just a whole other animal. So the way FDA, the sort of Band-Aid they've been putting on things has been to use these locked algorithms. So they'll say, okay, you train up your model, but then you fix that model, and only that model is allowed to be deployed, even if it could be improved by the data that it's currently seeing. I don't know, because that would need new approval. But they recognize that can be hamstringing AI to some degree, and they want it to be able to learn. So in case there's data drift and things like that, it can adapt to it. So that's the framework they're building towards. And one of the ways they're trying to do it is through this total product lifecycle approach, which to any of you who are familiar with their work on the pre-certification pilot program, this is a very similar sort of mentality. There's 4 big steps here, so we're going to sort of take each of them apart. So the very first one is establishing these expectations, a sort of culture, and working around what they've deemed good machine learning practices. This is a whole other time point. It'll be number 8, so we're going to deal with it in more detail later. So we'll sort of skip that for now, but keep it in mind. The second one is sort of where a lot of the action is, and this is sort of broken down, I think, more easily into understanding it as the predetermined change control plan, which has 2 specific parts to it. So the first one is the SAMD, which stands for Software as a Medical Device, pre-specifications, and then the algorithm change protocol. So the way to think about this is if you develop some kind of an AI system, it's going to be changing. What the FDA wants is for you to tell it the SPS, so say, here's the ways in which we anticipate it will change. We don't have a crystal ball, but we think it might expand to these additional uses. We think the performance might change. We think we're going to start using these different data inputs. We don't know, but here's how we expect things to go. And then similarly, they want you to stipulate the ACP and saying, when those things happen, here's how we'll go about them. Here's how we'll implement those particular changes. And you see this graph here, right? This is a little bit of detail on the ACP in terms of trying to understand what kinds of things they're going to be looking for. The way that those come together is here in step 3, which is how we're sort of going to monitor them. And I think that's best seen through the following flowchart here, which is, let's say we start in the upper left-hand corner. We say, okay, you have this product, it's an AI/ML system. Have you gotten it approved, by the FDA? Yes, great, congratulations. That was, no small feat. So moving to the right, you've made some modifications, to the software. So the first question you ask is, okay, would these modifications require a new 510K under the regular guidance? And that guidance, has a flow chart here that tells you what to do. But the basic idea is like, hey, look, did you change it substantially? Is there a new risk? Is it really affecting the functionality? So if there is a big change, then you're going to have to do something about it. In this flow chart, it says, hey, if we're not hitting that threshold, great. You don't have to do anything. You just document. If it would require a 510K normally, The next question to ask is, does it fall within that sort of agreed upon SPS and ACP? So right ahead of time, you said, hey, FDA, I told you, here's what I might change, here's how I do it. If I'm following those changes and I'm falling within those guardrails, then they say, great, nothing further needed. All you have to do is document. You don't have to go through that 510K process like you used to in the past. So that's a really nice streamlining effect. But let's say, right, I didn't have that crystal ball. We ended up having to change it in ways that I didn't anticipate. If that's the case, you still have to ask the further question, do these modifications lead to a new intended use? If they don't, then you get to do this more focused review of your SPS and ACP. So maybe you just have to update that part. So it's onerous, but not as onerous as if you really do have this new intended use. Then you've got to go through the pre-market review process again, right? So you might have to do another 510K or something like that. So this is a nice way that they're really trying to come up with, some ways to head things off at the pass and streamline the process. And then finally, point number 4 of this process deals with real-world performance, which again was, a sort of big hallmark of the pre-cert pilot program. There's not a lot of public information on this. Even in their guidance, they're not particularly clear. They note, hey, look, there might be various other unique mechanisms you could use in order to be transparent to convey this information to the various stakeholders. Right, in this case, it might be FDA, device companies, other collaborators, the public at large. This little graph off to the right is how they've done it with the pre-cert pilot program. So this is an area for exploration, but it's something they're clearly thinking about and trying to come up with strong pathways to do. So overall, that's like a very quick summary of their white paper and the framework that they've proposed. So that's point 1. Time point 2. This was when they introduced collaborative communities. These have been around, for a little while. They're basically, it's a forum in which both private and public sector members can come to work on medical device challenges and achieve common objectives and outcomes. The FDA can be a member of that, but they don't have to be. And so you'll see on here, there's the Xavier AI World Consortium. So they were consulted with the FDA on the AI-based SAMD action plan, which we'll get to in a little bit. So this is just another sort of lever you can use to try and influence FDA. They even give you a tool set. So let's say you want to build one of these collaborative communities. FDA says, hey, here's a whole set of tools you can use to help build one of your own. If you'd like to invite us, great, but you don't have to. You can sort of do it on your own and influence us that way. So a great way they're sort of looking to the public and a diverse sort of set of stakeholders to help as they think through these really thorny issues. Okay, time point number 3 was a radiology workshop that they held. This workshop had a ton of different presentations. The vast majority of them are from non-FDA personnel, so really interesting, but doesn't necessarily, let you know how the FDA is thinking about this issue. It's good that they're taking in that information from these other third parties, but they didn't necessarily disclose a whole lot in terms of their sort of novel approaches in this particular workshop. There were some relevant things that they mentioned, and you see these are the FDA branded slides. And so, they note, hey, look, in January of 2020, we did this reclassification from the more onerous PMA down to the 510K. So there's, some information like that there. But in general, it's just a great resource to sort of see what lots of interesting stakeholders are thinking about AI, radiology, and the FDA. Time point number 4 deals with PEAC, which is the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. This is sort of the first and only advisory committee where all the members are either patients or caregivers or representatives of patient organizations. And the idea is to bring them together for this sort of broad discussion to help inform device innovation, development, evaluation, access, sort of things like that. And they do it across a broad array of areas. And one of the areas in which they did it was AI and ML. Because of course, there's lots of issues that are directly affecting these patients and caregivers. So they wrote this report in October of 2020, an executive summary that they presented, and then was actually used by the FDA in issuing their AI ML action plan, which we'll get to in a little bit. So again, another lever that FDA is looking to in terms of broadening the set of stakeholders that they look to for advice and input. So if you're looking to influence the FDA, This is another way that you could do that, right, is through the PEAC to try and help create these reports that then inform the guidances that they create. Okay, here's the AI ML action plan that I've been discussing. So in this, it's maybe a little less action sort of planny than you might think. A lot of it is sort of commitments that they've made. So it's not necessarily introducing a lot of new information. It's sort of saying that, hey, look, we heard you. We solicited your feedback on that AI white paper. We think you guys have put out a lot of great thoughts, and we're planning on taking that to heart and integrating it, and sort of making it part of our future guidances. And so they highlighted what I thought were a couple of important issues here in terms of what they're planning on doing on that front. So the first is really fleshing out that predetermined change control plan. So when I was going through that SPS and ACP earlier, you might have had some follow-up questions or wondered about some specificity there, and FDA recognizes that, and they know we want to create a lot of clarity on that point because a lot is going to be riding on it. So they're letting us know, hey, we're planning on doing that through an additional guidance. They noted that in their development of good machine learning practice, there's lots of other people who are developing those things, right? IEEE, IMDRF, and they sort of made this commitment that we plan to try and harmonize as best as we can. So again, there's not a variety of standards floating out there that's making it really hard for companies and developers to comply with. They said we're going to hold a workshop on transparency, which they did. That's our next time point. They said we want to really focus on these issues of algorithmic bias and algorithmic robustness, which are very important, and you probably see splashed all over the AI headlines these days. And then finally, they said they want to work with a diverse set of stakeholders on understanding and establishing real-world performance, because again, they know this is an area where there's lots of tricky things when you get to the deployment aspects, and often the kinks are more difficult than one would anticipate, and so they want to try and sort of work this out on a real-world basis with volunteers essentially. So all very admirable commitments, sounds like good and important things. So exciting to see as they start to follow through with these. Time point 6 deals with the transparency workshop that they held. And so essentially here, it's very similar to that radiology AI workshop, where basically, there was some presentations from the FDA, but the vast majority of them were from other stakeholders. So again, it's of limited utility in some sense in getting an idea how exactly FDA is thinking through the issue. They do at least sort of let us know how they're thinking about this notion of transparency, as in the degree to which appropriate information about the device is being clearly communicated to the stakeholders. So they're clearly emphasizing this is an area of major importance to them. As a public agency, it's particularly important to have this level of transparency. But we're still going to have to sort of wait for some more details in terms of how they want to meet that issue out. Okay. Time point number 7 was the list of their AI ML devices. So basically what they did was they created this open resource to the public where they said, here's all of the AI sort of enabled medical devices that are currently marketed. They let us know that this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, and in fact they posted some resources for here's other databases out there that are sort of not through us at the FDA, but they're again clearly trying to assist with this issue of transparency in order to sort of help this information be more readily available and searchable for academics, researchers, anyone who would sort of find this information helpful. So what in this information might be helpful? It's not exactly intuitive, so I thought maybe we'd walk through a little bit to see what could be helpful. And in general, this information will be of interest to you if you're working on a device, you find some other similar device that is FDA approved, and you want to understand how the FDA might sort of think about or treat your device. So let's say we just randomly grab one from here. It brings up, this sort of page of information, and it tells us, okay, they did it through the 510K pathway. So I know, they didn't have to do the PMA. They're probably a class 2 device. So, the FDA is thinking about it as sort of middle of the road in terms of risk. It has their regulation number and their classification product code, which we'll look at in a second. It tells you what the decision was for their application. So for 510K, what they're looking for is substantial equivalence, right? So you say, hey, here's this other predicate device, I'm just like them. And then hopefully the FDA says, you're right, you're substantially equivalent, so therefore you're cleared. And then there's a summary, which we'll look at in a minute too. So if we click on that regulation number, like I noted before, you get hit with just this wall of text, right? But there's actually some really great stuff in here. So for instance, they'll tell you, here's what the classification was. Oh, we were right, it's class 2. And then as part of class 2, it has these special controls. So if I'm doing a similar device, likely it's going to have to meet these same special controls that are specific, to this particular regulation number. And so you can see, things like about the design verification and validation and what those requirements are. It's going to have labeling requirements. So again, there's lots of, sort of good information you can glean so you can stay ahead of things and know you're providing FDA with what they want. In terms of the classification product code, again, you get some useful information here. You get sort of a definition of what the particular device is you're looking at, the state, whether in this case we learned that it's software only, as well as the technical method that's sort of being used here. So again, you can look to these as similar descriptors that you might want to use for your product. And then finally, there's the summary, which has tons of great information. So in this case, I just took a little smattering of screenshots here, but you'll note, for instance, it says, this particular device is for prescription only, which is an interesting issue as we deal with digital therapeutics and trying to find out whether they should be over the counter or sort of prescription only. So again, you can sort of find that information. You can also find some great information on what that device used as their predicate device. So you might, if you're similar enough to this product, you might consider using them, or you might consider using their predicate device because, FDA is already familiar with it. And you get lots of great details on that. In addition, you also might learn, did they list a reference device, which basically they can be used to help support your scientific methodology or your standard reference values. They can't be used as a predicate device, but they're still, sort of used as a supporting device. So again, there's lots of sort of great information you can glean from that. Additionally, right, the things that I cut out here, you get more details on the description, the intended use of your particular device, indications for use, summary of its technical characteristics, performance data. So again, a great way to get lots of publicly available information that might be helpful to you. And then finally, we come to time point 8, which is another sort of really interesting and meaty one. So this was the most recent and our last time point for what the FDA has done. And this is the release of what they called good good machine learning principles, or GMLP. This is sort of, in the tradition of what you might see as like CGMP, which is current good manufacturing practice. This is in the context of drugs and biologics, where we try and ensure, safety and efficacy, the main mission of the FDA in this world. And we try and do it through instituting these standards. And so FDA is trying to do that on the AI and machine learning front, which is a sort of tricky challenge. So I'm not going to walk through sort of all, 10 of these, because you can sort of, review them on your own. But there were a couple of pieces I thought I might highlight that I think are of particular interest. The first one is they note, how important this is to make sure you're gleaning multidisciplinary expertise, right? So having these sort of cross-disciplinary, conversations, I think has become a large priority, and is something that AIMI clearly values and sort of recognizes is important. And I think so does FDA, because it's going to be really important not only for developing this great technology, but also actually deploying it in the real world and making sure it can have the impact that all of us want it to have. So it's definitely a big focus of FDA, which is great to see. The next is to note that they call out sort of for their clinical study participants, and their data sets. They want to make sure they're representative of the intended patient population. So in this case, another big issue, it's tying back again to FDA's concerns, like we mentioned, over algorithmic bias and algorithm robustness, that these are often very central issues. And so again, something as you're developing this technology, you'd want to be attentive to, because FDA will be thinking about it in the back of their mind, if not the front of their mind. In number 6 here, I wanted to zero in on this notion of intended use, right? So they tell you, hey, when you're developing, the sort of design of this model, we want it to be tailored to the available data and to reflect the intended use of the device. So FDA is clearly pushing you, hey, we want you to be bearing in mind how you intend to use this device. On the legal side, it's interesting to note you might also want to be thinking about unintended uses that still might be foreseeable. So in the world of products liability, of which I think I've given a more fulsome talk to Amy on in the past, which was a lot of fun looking at sort of AI and products liability. But in this particular case, this is just noting that you can be held liable not just for someone misusing your product in an unintended way, so long as it was foreseeable. So you might think, although I don't expect my doctor or my sort of nurse to use it in this way, is it reasonable for me to have anticipated that they would misuse it in that way? And if so, you might be on the hook. And this, again, it ties into a lot of other interesting sort of legal doctrines. So the big one is this doctrine of federal preemption. So this is the issue where you say, hey, look, most of these products liability, these tort lawsuits, when you're getting sued, it's usually all happening under state law. But the FDA is a federal agency, and they're operating under the FD&C Act, which is a federal law. And normally the rule is federal law trumps state law. So if I have this device and I got it approved by the FDA, if it ends up leading to someone's injury, shouldn't I be insulated from sort of getting accused of product liability? Because the FDA, they gave the stamp of approval. They said it was safe. So that's not always the case. That usually is the case if the FDA went through the PMA, the sort of pre-market approval of your device. But if you went through the 510K pathway, you may not be able to avail yourself of that preemption. And in particular, there's case law that states, if you want to appeal to the current good manufacturing practices, those are not preempted by federal law. So although there's no case law on this at this point, a clever lawyer might draw the analog between CGMP and GMLP and say, hey, if the CGMP was not preempted, then similarly maybe GMLP is not preempted as well, and that could mean you end up with that liability even though the use was unintended because it was foreseeable. So there's lots of interesting things to think about here, both in terms of what's the FDA going to do in order to try and make this offering safe, but also how am I going to protect myself from liability on other fronts as well, which may not always line up with what just doing what the FDA told you to do. So lots of sort of interesting players and dynamics and tensions here. I thought it'd be fun to highlight. Listen to the lawyer talk, fun to highlight. I don't know if fun is the right word, but interesting perhaps. The next issue was focusing on how FDA is concerned about the sort of HCI, human-computer interaction component, right? And the big feature that they sort of highlight here is the human in the loop, right, which we've heard lots about. And they note if you're developing a device in which there is a human in the loop, human factors and interpretability considerations must be taken into account. This is intriguing because I think it opens up the question of whether it will be easier to get a device, an AI, sort of enabled device through FDA that has a human in the loop or doesn't. Often we think of having a human in the loop as being more related to safety. So we think that might give you an edge. But in doing that, FDA now will have some additional requirements on you. You have to really work through the human factors. You have to work through the interpretability considerations. And there's a lot of complexity and difficulty there, and lots of concerns, as we've seen in the literature, with things like automation bias and people being overly trusting of these AI systems. So I think it's not necessarily a sort of clear-cut question over which solution will be easier. And it's also an open question how the development of that human sort of AI interaction will go across these sets of problems. For very small and sort of discrete problems, I think the trend we've seen is that humans are superior on these tasks. Then eventually, a human-computer hybrid is superior, and then eventually the computer alone is superior. So chess, Go is another great example of these very constrained board games in which first humans dominated, then the sort of human-computer symbiosis dominated, and now humans only muck things up if they try and get in there and help the computers. They're just better. The medical context is significantly, less constrained and more complicated. So I think likely we won't be seeing that sort of trend anytime soon. But there's still this issue, I think, to think through in terms of, being able to explain the interpretability considerations to the FDA in a way that's satisfactory to them, that still might make you lean towards trying to cut the human. out of the loop if you can do so in a safe way. So again, an interesting tension that the FDA has picked a side on, and we'll see how it affects development of this technology. Next is sort of their focus here on performance related to clinically relevant conditions. So again, I think this is a focus on the real world sort of aspects of things, recognizing that, hey, just because something worked very well in your very sort of clean environment, we want to understand that the clinical realm often is complicated and messy and challenging and difficult, and we want to make sure that your device is still safe and still effective even in those scenarios. So again, having that eye towards reality is something FDA will really be thinking about. So it's good for you to have that mentality as well. And then maybe the last thing to highlight here, is just noting that in this case, users, could be a variety of people. It might be a healthcare provider. It might be the patient itself. In terms of these AI-enabled devices, you definitely want to think about, clearly about who your user is. And then also, want to sort of wrestle with what are we going to consider to be essential information. So FDA has, stipulated a little bit. They noted that this is going to include things like intended use, performance for different subgroups, info on training and testing data sets. FDA hasn't said anything about this yet, but maybe it's an interesting application for these sort of nutrition labels for data, the model cards or data sheets for data sets that have been promulgated. FDA is also going to be looking for known limitations, as well as the means for communicating this and these kinds of concerns to the developer and the manufacturer. So again, you can see there's going to be a lot of argument here on what's going to constitute essential, as part of that definition of information, and sort of how much of it has to be given, how regularly, to whom, and by what means. So lots of open questions there still, but clearly FDA has picked it as an important issue. Okay, so that wraps it up for all of the FDA related time points that they've made public in terms of how they're thinking through things. I want to sort of maybe quickly buzz through this because I want to leave some time open for questions. But this is highlighting a paper from some of our Stanford's own, from Dan Ho and James Zhu and others, where they were basically doing a review of a great number of these FDA AI-based medical devices that have been approved, and noting some potential criticism. So probably the biggest one was noting, hey, look, only 4 out of these 130 devices included prospective studies. And in fact, of the 54 devices they deemed high risk, none of them had any prospective studies going on there. So again, they're sort of highlighting some concern over the methodology that FDA uses. Again, this is a tricky area. There's significant tension between wanting to ensure the safety and efficacy of these devices, but also not wanting to hinder innovation and sort of keep potentially useful therapies or diagnostics out of the hands of people who need it. So I think this is a very sort of helpful counterpoint and sort of demonstrates that the difficulty of that tension and the things FDA is going to have to wrestle with. One of the other interesting points they note here is that only 17 of the devices out of that 130 reported demographic subgroup performance, which again is a very important consideration when we're thinking of things like algorithmic bias and the issues of robustness. So that may be something that changes as FDA increases their emphasis on those issues, as that's definitely an important area. Okay, I think with that, I'll take a breath and pause here and see if anyone has any questions. Thanks so much for listening.
I'll start with one that's a quick one, Zach, and that is,
sure.
When you submit to the FDA, do you have to submit your code or reveal your IP to the FDA?
Yeah, so I think it depends, and maybe is a little bit outside of the scope of my expertise. In general, what's going to be required is going to be enough to convince the FDA of the safety and effectiveness of your device. And so if we're in that sort of software as a medical device realm, I think typically you are going to need, or they are going to need, some level of access to take a look at that and sort of verify that that it's meeting sort of those criteria. Similarly, there's loads of other sort of guidance documents. Again, FDA is so big. There's lots of requirements that deal with cybersecurity measures and things like that. So I know that there's significant sort of checking that needs to be done on lots of that. but honestly, I'm not confident to sort of speak too much on the specifics for how that might be handled. So for instance, I know this is an issue that comes up in the copyright context. If you, let's say, develop a video game and you're very concerned about releasing the source code to the Copyright Office, even though you want to make sure you get protection for it. And so often there's some mechanisms where you can sort of release segments or subsections to it for that level of protection. The risk, again, for this is much lower, which is why I would presume it's not the same case with the FDA there. And so more likely, it's sort of managed contractually, so you have to disclose that information, but you still get sort of protection for it. Either you get continued protection, let's say you protected it as a patent, no matter who you disclose it to, you get that protection. Or often, if you're protecting it as a trade secret, you get an exemption or a carve out if you're disclosing it to the FDA for regulatory purposes. It doesn't make you lose your protection of that information as trade secret. Otherwise, it would just be really hard to try and get software through the FDA. So yeah, I wish I had sort of more detail or better information to give you there. Maybe the only thing I can say is there's nothing unique or sort of different as of now on the AI side of things in terms of all other software. So when you're pushing it through that 510K pathway, or the PMA if you have to, there's no sort of unique different level of disclosures you have to do for AI versus non-AI software at this point.
Zach, another question from the chat. This is from Shlomit, and it's a question I get asked a lot. Who is liable for these devices if there's a mistake made either by the human or by the algorithm? How do we sort that out?
Oh, yeah. What a fantastic question in lots of ways. Yeah, it's the $1 million question everyone is sort of a buzz with and thinking about. I'll do a little self-promotion and note that I wrote a paper on this topic, or co-authored it with Matt Lundgren, who I know we're all sad to have no longer be a part, directly with AIMI, and Pranav Rajprakash, who was a PhD student at the time in Andrew Ng's lab, now is a faculty member over at Harvard. And we were trying to address exactly that issue. We did it in a fairly narrow scope. So we're looking at machine vision applications, medical machine vision applications. And the way that we approached it, and again, this is a continuously evolving space, and as of yet, there's no really definitive case law. So all of it's going to be speculative to some degree. But there's sort of a couple of players in terms of who you could think liability might fall onto. So, one might be the physician himself or herself using the technology. And that would fall into the framework of torts liability or, medical malpractice, essentially. And it's an interesting area there. The typical standard is, did you comport with medical custom? It differs from state to state, and it's changing in some places. Instead of maybe comporting with medical custom, they're erring towards, did you behave in a way that's reasonable for a physician, given the state of the state of the art at that time for medical knowledge? So whenever you're using a new technology, there's always some risk or concern there that I might not be comporting with custom because it's so new. So again, the more sort of standardized it is, the more protection there is often there for you. That being said, the meta-analyses, I think some even done by some of the scholars here at Stanford Law School, Michelle Mello, I think in particular, have shown that in malpractice cases in general, the physicians are very rarely held liable, even in cases in which there's a substantial, evidence against them for malpractice. So often, I think, personally, that risk, maybe sounds very scary, but, if you're using a device, it was approved by the FDA, you're doing it in a sense in which you think you could plausibly explain to a jury, that it's reasonable, those are the kinds of things you might think to as protective factors. But again, we don't have a sort of really great case to point to, on that front. Similarly, a hospital might be held liable, for using that particular tool in a number of different ways. Maybe they're not supervising, they're failing to supervise the doctors correctly. Maybe they failed to train the doctors correctly. There might be some kind of vicarious liability claim that you might be able to make depending on who's using it. And again, there's tricky issues there with, are the doctors or sort of nurses, are they employees? Are they independent contractors? And, maybe that sort of changes the analysis. So definitely, lots of additional wrinkles there. And then maybe sort of the third one to look to is the developer themselves, right? So who created this product? That in general, as I sort of mentioned before, you might think of in the product's liability framework. But again, that's challenging because in products liability, they define product as tangible property. And so software, courts have been loath basically to implement products liability for software, essentially purely software. That might be changing, but again, we haven't seen any really definitive cases on that as of yet. Maybe the sort of one other wrinkle, to mention on that side is that, in these cases of where software leads to harm, we often see these emerge under breach of warranty sorts of claims. So it ends up being contractual. So let's say, you're the developer and the hospital sort of purchased this from you and it ended up leading to some harm. Depending on the terms that you negotiated in that contract, you might be able to sue for some sort of breach of contract or breach of warranty. So pragmatically, often the way this gets handled is, contractually, putting in protections for that kind of thing. Maybe negotiating a limitation on liability for those sorts of situations or a liability cap, and also maybe creating, also using indemnification provisions, right, as a way for a hospital to protect themselves. So they might fear if we're going to get sued by some patient who is injured by using this particular tool, then perhaps I can have the developer indemnify me, and then the developer further protects themselves, usually via the acquisition of insurance. So that if one of these lawsuits comes up, they're the ones who are going to end up being the ones who have to foot the bill. Essentially, they can try and pass off, or mitigate some of that risk with insurance. So that's like maybe a little more detail than you wanted, but a sort of lay of the land for what I think is, a very interesting question in terms of trying to think through who's going to be liable. And as of yet, big question mark, but we'll see. Try to keep your nose clean is probably the best advice I could give.
Great, thank you. Another question from Tamiko from the Q&A, and it really relates to research laboratories that may be affiliated with a healthcare organization, and they create a model, maybe a prediction model using research in humans, and then they put that model they implement that, and don't feel they need to go through the FDA for that particular process. And maybe they could eventually make that part of the standard of care and more widely disseminate it. So I guess the question gets to, at what point does someone need to, or to whom does the FDA's regulations apply?
Yeah, great question. This is sort of the primary step one, sort of glossed over, I think, on my second slide in terms of figuring out, am I subject to FDA's regulatory authority? The sort of big question, if we're talking medical devices, is you have to figure out, do I actually have a medical device? And when you look at FDA's definition for medical device, you will notice it is very broad and very sweeping. Maybe a shoe could count as a medical device under this definition, your shirt maybe. It's intended to capture a lot. And so what that means is that a lot of this comes down to their sort of, discretion in some sense. They basically, they're only allowed to regulate what that definition says. They don't want to be caught in a situation in which they're, legally unable to regulate something. So they cast it very broad, and then they just reasonably choose, right? So they're not out there trying to regulate shoes, so that's fine. But if someone started making a shoe that really, sort of substantially altered the structure of someone's physiology or was used for some diagnostic capacity, they want the ability to come in and say, yes, that's the kind of thing we can regulate. So that at least lets you know for what you've developed, probably it's the kind of thing FDA could regulate if they want to. That being said, they have an astronomical job in terms of the number of things they have to regulate based on their personnel. So realistically, they're going to try and pick the most important or the most sensitive issues. Sometimes that comes up by being alerted by, let's say the FTC lets them know, hey, we see someone who's doing some marketing or some use of something, and it seems really, sort of false or misleading or deceptive, or likely to, lead to consumer harm. That might let FDA know. Maybe you have a competitor who's really, working hard to put their device through, FDA, and they notice you just kind of skating past and not doing it, FDA works on, tips lots of times. So if you're that competitor, you might say, oh, hey, FDA, have you noticed these guys on their website? Check out what they're up to. It seems like they should be talking to you. And, that's another way you might get on their radar, and you might get, a cease and desist letter from the FDA or something like that. There are, this is a big question. There are lots of carve-outs, right? And FDA has put out numerous recent guidances on this topic. So if you fall more into the wellness space, there might be some exemptions for you. If you're a mobile medical application, they have another guidance on that, in which case, they sort of clarify, here's MMAs, mobile medical apps. Here's MMAs that are subject to, our enforcement. Here's ones that are not. And then here's some in the middle where we say they're subject to enforcement discretion. So, maybe treatment of certain mental health disorders. They say, look, we're going to let it slide for now. But if you start doing something real nefarious or, that looks really irresponsible, we have the ability to come in and stop you. Maybe the last big one to mention is CDS. FDA also put out another guidance on this to try and sort of illuminate. Often there's a carve out for this, clinician, sort of diagnostic support software. And they put out a guidance trying to show, well, it's going to depend on whether you get exempted or not. Some of them we'll call device CDS, and those might be regulated. And it's dependent on factors like, is your device used by the patient directly, or is it used by a healthcare professional? Another one related specifically to AI that they have is, is an explanation available for what the CDS provided. And if there's not that level of transparency there, then that CDS is more often subject to FDA's regulation. So it's a great question. I haven't sort of done it justice here, but that's sort of the big landscape is that probably, you could be subject to FDA's regulation. The question is, are you setting off enough alarm bells that they would sort of really care about it? That's going to be the more practical matter.
Great, thanks. And since we got started a little late, I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question, combine things from the chat. All of these questions relate to adaptive algorithms or algorithms that adapt over time. You may have noted that when the FDA came out with that original white paper in 2019, some senators sent the FDA a letter and said, it's not clear you have the authority to regulate not algorithms or not devices, but actually organizations that are creating those algorithms and devices. And so there, I guess, some questions about how likely is that to be actually implemented in the end? And then when you think about these adaptive algorithms, there are some that are really could be designed to continuously learn as they're exposed to new data. And there's another question in the chat about what about device recalls if a performance degrades over time? Is there any language for that? So,
those are all goodies. Yeah, I love it.
Lots to talk about there.
So all right, I'll try and take them in order. So for the first one, no one has a crystal ball. If I had to guess, I would say I think it's likely not going to be a problem. And the reason I would surmise that is because it's also a critical component of FDA's pre-cert pilot program, in which they're really looking to, regulate not just the products themselves, but the organizations that are putting them out. So, right, totally non-specific to AI, machine learning, just, is it software, is it digital health? We want to try and regulate you. Do you have a good culture of care and adaptation and things like that? And that's been running for a significant amount of time now with the 9 companies they currently sort of have as part of that pilot program. I think, there's a lot of industry, sort of assistance and support behind it. I think it's likely to come to fruition in some form or other. So if I had to wager how that will play out in the AI space, I would think it'll follow the momentum of the pre-cert pilot. Because again, that's just, it's a very big, very important initiative for FDA. So who knows? We might be surprised, but I think probably that's the case. On the continuously learning or adapting algorithms, I remember what the last question was. I forgot what the middle one is. Can you refresh me?
Yeah, continuous adapting algorithms and then recalls of algorithms that might degrade over time.
Right. So FDA is definitely interested in and excited by the notion of being able to approve continuously learning algorithms. And in fact, that's the big motivation of them trying to put out, the white paper and things like that, is they recognize our current fix using just the locked ones, it's handcuffing. These algorithms, they could be better, they could be, getting better faster. if we enable this. They could also be getting worse faster. They could also be leading to a lot of significant harm. So they want to be thoughtful about it, but that is their overall goal of what they're trying to head for. And part of that is going to see, hey, is this predetermined change control plan, right? That SPS, the ACP, the sort of letting the FDA know ahead of time, here's what we're going to be changing. Is that going to be sufficient? Probably not on its own, but if you pair it with the real world performance, and this is likely related to the sort of recall issue as well. So if it's changing in a way that you stipulated to us, we knew and we are sort of approved of, and then we're also getting kind of regular, transparency or peaks, into your real world performance to make sure no alarm bells are going off. There's no sort of big concerns here, or you're not maybe the subject of a major data drift, or often, right, things that just happen in the healthcare world, right? You open a new center, you get an influx of new patients. There's a merger, between hospitals, and all of a sudden your demographics change a lot. All of these things could have an impact, and I think FDA is hoping that will be mitigated by the real world performance element. How that actually gets meted out, very important, right? And I think will be intimately tied with the recall potential. The sort of versioning for the recall, I don't know exactly how that'll go. That might become a dicey area as well. But if you're clearly sort of noting, hey, here's each version that we've sort of gone through and how each one didn't lead to those problems, that might even be solvable as well. So really great questions. I think no definitive answers yet, but really interesting areas to be looking for how FDA handles it.
Well, Zach, thank you so much. Such important information for anyone who's developing models and wants to have a beneficial impact on patients by making them products. We appreciate your time here today, and thank you, audience, for all your questions. And thank you, Zach.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the great engagement. Really interesting questions, guys. And hopefully I will see some of you in the office hours dealing with these same thorny sorts of issues and questions.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks all. Take care.